Hello students, this is our DME class. Today we will start our new chapter of bearings. This chapter has two parts. First is sliding contact bearing and second is rolling contact bearings. So today we will discuss the introduction part of sliding contact bearings and its types. So first of all we need to understand what is a bearing. So a bearing is a machine element which support another moving machine element known as journal. What does it mean? Means for example there is a shaft here which is used to transmit power from motor to the pulley. This shaft has to be supported, and the function of a bearing is to support the shaft so that the shaft may not get deflected. So, bearing is a machine element which support another moving machine element known as journal. Means bearing is a machine element which support the shaft, which is moving machine element, and this shaft is also known as journal. Actually, journal is a part of the shaft which is inside the bearing. It permits a relative motion between contact surfaces of members while carrying the load. So, in the bearings, there is a relative motion between contact surfaces of the members. Like the shaft is rotating, but the bearing is stationary. So, there is a relative motion between the bearing and the shaft. A little consideration will show that due to relative motion between contact surfaces, a certain amount of power is wasted in overcoming frictional resistance. So as you can see, there is a friction between the shaft and the bearing surface. So there will be a little power loss when we use our bearings. But this can be reduced by using lubricants. In order to reduce frictional resistance and wear, in some cases to carry away the heat generated, a layer of fluid known as lubricant may be provided. So as I have told you, there is a friction between the bearing and the journal, and due to this friction, the heat may be generated, and there is a wear of the surfaces. So we provide a lubricant between the journal and the bearing. The lubricant is used to separate the journal and bearing, and usually a mineral oil refined from petroleum, but vegetable oils, silicone oils, greases, etc. may be used. So what is the classification of bearings? Depending upon the direction of load to be supported. So first we classify the bearings on the basis of direction of load to be supported. So the bearings under this group are classified as radial bearings and thrust bearings. So what is a radial bearing? In radial bearing, the load acts perpendicular to the direction of motion of the moving element. Means suppose look at this diagram. So we have a shaft here and it is rotating clockwise, for example, and a load is acting perpendicular to the axis of the shaft, and this is our bearing. So a radial bearing, the load acts perpendicular to the direction of motion of the moving element. So the load act perpendicular to the rotation or direction of motion of the moving element, then it is called radial load, and the bearings we use is called radial bearing. What is thrust bearing? The load acts along the axis of rotation. So this shaft, for example, rotating in clockwise direction, and the load is acting along the axis of the shaft, then this bearing is called thrust bearing. See this diagram as well. This is the diagram for radial bearing, in which the load acts perpendicular to the shaft axis, and the bearings we use is called radial bearing. And this is the diagram for thrust bearing, in which the load acts along the axis of the shaft, and the bearings we use in this situation is called thrust bearing. Second, we can classify the bearings depending upon the nature of contact. The bearings under this group are classified as sliding contact bearing and rolling contact bearing. So what is sliding contact bearing? The sliding takes place along the surfaces of contact between moving element and fixed element. So if we see this diagram, this is our journal which is moving member, and this is our bearing which is stationary member. So there is a sliding, we can say friction or sliding action takes place between the moving member and the stationary member, that is called bearing. So these type of bearings are called sliding contact bearings. As you have seen in the machine drawing, There is a drawing for plumber block. That was also a bearing which is of sliding contact type. The sliding contact bearings are also known as plain bearings. So these are also called plain bearings. So what is rolling contact bearing? In rolling contact bearing, the steel balls or rollers are interposed between the moving and fixed elements. Actually, the rolling contact bearings are also called anti-friction bearings because the friction that occurs in the sliding contact bearings is reduced to very much extent with the help of balls that we used between the fixed element and moving element. So these are called roller bearings. That is, sliding friction is converted into rolling friction. Actually, these are ball bearings. We also called it ball bearings or roller bearings. So we have a outer ring here and we have inner ring. In between, we have cage for the balls and we use steel balls for the friction or for reducing the friction. Types of sliding contact bearing. Now, in this slide, we will discuss about the sliding contact bearings. Rolling contact bearings we will discuss in the upcoming videos. The sliding contact bearings in which the sliding action is along the circumference of a circle or arc of a circle and carrying the radial loads are known as journal or sleeve bearings. So as you can see the diagrams, there is a sliding contact between the journal and bearings. So these are sliding contact bearings. Balls are not used in such kind of bearings. So in the first figure, you can see the full journal bearing. What is a full journal bearing? When the angle of contact of the bearing with the journal is 360 degree. So this angle of contact between the bearing and journal is a complete circle that is 360 degree. Then this type of bearing is called full journal bearing. When the angle of contact with the bearing and journal is 120 degree, then it is called partial journal bearing. So see in this diagram, the angle of contact between the journal and bearing is only 120 degree. This is called partial journal bearing. In the previous case, it was a complete circle of 360 degree. It was a full journal bearing. But this, if the angle of contact is 120 degree, then it is called partial journal bearing. And this is also partial journal bearing and it is fitted. It is called fitted because see carefully in this diagram, the diameter of the journal and diameter of the bearing is same. But in this diagram, the diameter of the journal is small as compared to the diameter of the bearing. Okay. Another way we can classify the bearings as thick film bearings, thin film bearings, zero film bearings, hydrostatic or externally pressurized bearings. What is thick film bearings? In those in which the working surfaces are completely separated from each other by lubricant. So if we use lubricant between the surfaces, that is journal and bearings, we use lubricant in between and these two surfaces are completely separated from each other with the help of a lubricant, then this is called thick film bearing, means thick film of lubricant, and it is also called hydrodynamic bearing. Second is thin film bearings, those in which although the lubricant is present, we use the lubricant in it, the working surfaces are in partial contact with each other. Means these working surfaces of a sliding contact bearing have a partial contact. Although we have used the lubricant, but the surfaces are still in contact with each other. These are called thin film bearings. Means the lubricant film is very thin. Zero film bearings in which we don't use lubricant. The zero film bearings are those in which operate without any lubricant present. Okay, if we use the bearings without any lubricant, then it is called zero film bearings. Okay guys, rest we will cover in the next video. Hope you guys understand. Thank you.